Cullman County, Alabama, March 15, 1980. The smell of fresh coffee still lingered in the kitchen when Margaret Holloway noticed her husband's work boots were missing from the back porch. At 6:30 a.m., the sun barely crested the pine trees surrounding their modest farmhouse, casting long shadows across the dew-covered pasture where their cattle grazed peacefully. Robert Bobby Holloway, 34, had been the kind of man who never missed breakfast. For 8 years of marriage, Margaret could set her clock by the sound of his heavy footsteps on the wooden stairs at exactly 6:15 each morning. He'd kiss her forehead, pour himself black coffee from the percolator, and head out to check the livestock before most of Cullman County was even awake. But this Saturday morning felt different. The silence stretched too long. Bobby worked as a maintenance supervisor at the county courthouse, a steady job that had allowed them to buy the 40-acre property on the outskirts of town. He was known for his reliability, the kind of man who showed up early and stayed late, who fixed what was broken without being asked. His supervisor, Dale Morrison, often joked that Bobby knew more about the old courthouse's quirks than the architects who built it in 1923. The morning air carried the scent of honeysuckle and the distant sound of a tractor starting up on the neighboring farm. Margaret called Bobby's name from the porch, her voice echoing across the empty fields. Their German shepherd, Rex, whined softly at her feet. His ears perked as if he too sensed something was wrong. Bobby's 1976 Ford pickup truck sat in the gravel driveway, keys still hanging from the ignition. His wallet lay on the kitchen counter, next to a half-eaten piece of cornbread from the night before. In the bedroom, his Saturday clothes, worn jeans and a faded Alabama Crimson Tide t-shirt, were still folded neatly on the chair where he'd placed them before bed. Margaret found his coffee mug on the fence post near the barn, still warm to the touch. The ceramic was chipped on one side, a small imperfection from years of daily use. Steam rose faintly from the black liquid inside, suggesting Bobby had been there only minutes before. The morning stretched into afternoon with no sign of him. Margaret called the courthouse, but Dale Morrison said Bobby wasn't scheduled to work that weekend. She drove the familiar roads of Cullman County, stopping at the Piggly Wiggly, the Texaco station, and Murphy's Hardware, places where Bobby was known by name. No one had seen him. As the sun set behind the pine trees, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Margaret sat on the front porch with Rex at her side. The coffee mug still sat on the fence post, now cold and forgotten. Somewhere in the distance, a screech owl called out across the darkening fields, its cry echoing like a question that had no answer. Bobby Holloway had simply vanished, leaving behind only the lingering warmth of abandoned coffee and the growing certainty that something terrible had happened in the quiet minutes between dawn and daylight. Cullman County Sheriff's Department, March 16, 1980. Sheriff Tom Patterson had seen his share of missing persons cases in rural Alabama, but Bobby Holloway's disappearance didn't fit any familiar pattern. Men didn't just vanish from their own property, especially men like Bobby, steady, reliable, with no known enemies or debts that might explain a sudden departure. The search began at first light on Sunday. Volunteers from Cullman County gathered at the Holloway farm. Neighbors, church members from Pine Grove Baptist, and courthouse employees who knew Bobby's character. They spread across the rolling hills and dense pine forests, calling his name until their voices grew hoarse. Dale Morrison organized the courthouse crew, leading them through the wooded areas behind the property. Bobby wouldn't just walk off, he told anyone who'd listen. Something happened to him, mark my words. Dale had worked alongside Bobby for 6 years and had never known him to miss a day of work or break a promise. Margaret watched from the front porch as dozens of searchers combed through the tall grass and brambles. The Red Cross had set up a coffee station in her driveway, and the steady stream of volunteers offered both comfort and anxiety. Each returning group that shook their heads meant another hour of hope fading. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, Bobby's 78-year-old neighbor, brought over a casserole and stayed to keep Margaret company. "I seen him Friday evening working on that fence," she told Sheriff Patterson. "Looked normal as could be. Waved at me when I drove past." Eleanor had lived in Cullman County her entire life and prided herself on knowing everyone's business. But Bobby's disappearance left even her without theories. The search expanded over the following days. State police brought in tracking dogs that picked up Bobby's scent near the barn, but lost it abruptly about 50 yards from the house, near an old logging road that hadn't been used in years. The dogs circled in confusion, whining and pawing at the ground before giving up entirely. By the end of the first week, The volunteers had dwindled to a handful of close friends and family. Margaret's sister drove down from Huntsville to help manage the constant phone calls from well-meaning neighbors and reporters from the local newspaper. The Cullman Times ran a front-page story with Bobby's photograph, a formal portrait from the courthouse directory, showing his honest face and kind eyes. Sheriff Patterson found himself visiting the farm every few days, partly for the investigation and partly because he genuinely liked Margaret. She'd grown thin and pale, barely eating the endless stream of food that neighbors continued to bring. "There's got to be something we're missing," she'd tell him, standing in the same spot where Bobby's coffee mug had been found. 3 weeks after the disappearance, the official search was called off. The state police file remained open, but without leads or evidence, there was little more they could do. Bobby's supervisor at the courthouse kept his position available for 2 months before finally posting the job opening. Margaret refused to leave the farm, convinced that Bobby would return. She kept his coffee mug in the same cabinet, his clothes in the same dresser drawers. Rex aged quickly, spending most days lying by the fence where his master's scent had last been detected. As 1980 turned into 1981, then 1982, Bobby Holloway became another unsolved case in Cullman County's files. Margaret learned to manage the farm alone, though neighbors still stopped by to help with larger tasks. The community gradually stopped mentioning Bobby's name, not from lack of caring, but from the awkwardness of not knowing what to say. Years passed. Margaret's hair turned grey. Rex died of old age and was buried near the barn. The coffee mug developed more chips, but Margaret continued using it every morning, as if maintaining the ritual might somehow bring Bobby home. The truth was that Cullman County had simply accepted that some mysteries couldn't be solved, and some good people disappeared without explanation. It was easier than digging deeper into questions that might have uncomfortable answers. Cullman County Courthouse, December 1995. 15 years after Bobby Holloway's disappearance, cracks began appearing in more than just the courthouse's aging foundation. Dale Morrison had risen through the ranks to become head of maintenance, a promotion that came with access to county records Bobby had once meticulously reviewed. On a cold December morning, Morrison found himself alone in the courthouse basement, surrounded by boxes of old files scheduled for destruction as part of a routine records purge. Among the yellowed documents was a manila folder he'd hoped never to see again. Bobby's preliminary investigation notes, somehow missed during the original evidence collection. Morrison's hands shook as he opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of invoices he'd approved, construction contracts with inflated prices, and Bobby's careful handwriting documenting discrepancies that had seemed so minor 15 years ago. At the bottom of the stack was a carbon copy of a letter addressed to the State Attorney General's office, a letter that was never sent because Bobby had disappeared 5 days before the scheduled mailing date. The past decade and a half had not been kind to Morrison. His gambling addiction, which had started the whole mess, had only gotten worse. His wife had left him in 1987, taking their 2 children to live with her sister in Tennessee. The money he'd received from the construction kickbacks had long since been lost to poker games and horse racing. Now, staring at evidence of his crimes in the dusty courthouse basement, Morrison realized he'd been living on borrowed time. County Commissioner Herbert Lawson had died 3 years earlier, taking most of the scheme's details to his grave. Marcus Webb, the contractor who'd orchestrated the overbilling, had moved to Florida and rarely spoke to anyone from Cullman County. But Morrison remained, trapped in the same building where Bobby had worked, walking the same hallways, maintaining the same systems. Every day was a reminder of what he'd done, and every night brought dreams of that terrible morning when everything went wrong. Morrison stuffed Bobby's files into his jacket and left the courthouse early that day. At home, he sat at his kitchen table, the same table where he'd counted kickback money 20 years earlier, and read through Bobby's notes one more time. The evidence was damning, but more than that, it showed the kind of man Bobby had been: thorough, honest, determined to do the right thing even when it was difficult. That evening, Morrison drove to Murphy's Bar on the outskirts of town, a place where courthouse employees sometimes gathered after work. He ordered a whiskey and found himself telling the bartender about Bobby Holloway, not the truth, but memories of their friendship before everything went wrong. He was a good man, Morrison said, his voice thick with alcohol and guilt, better than any of us deserved. The bartender, a newcomer to Cullman County, listened politely but didn't understand the weight behind Morrison's words. How could he know that the man sitting at his bar carried the secret of one of the county's most enduring mysteries? Morrison stumbled home that night with Bobby's files still in his jacket pocket. He stood in his backyard, lighter in hand, ready to destroy the last evidence of his crimes. But something stopped him. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the hope that someday the truth would matter more than his own self-preservation. Instead of burning the files, Morrison placed them in a metal toolbox, the same kind Bobby had used to organize his maintenance supplies. He sealed the box in a plastic bag and buried it in his backyard garden, convincing himself it was temporary, that he'd know what to do with it eventually. Years passed. Morrison's guilt festered like an untreated wound. He started making anonymous donations to Margaret Holloway's church, small amounts that wouldn't be traced back to him, but somehow felt like penance. He avoided the section of the courthouse where Bobby's office had been, taking longer routes through the building to bypass those haunting hallways. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd become the keeper of the very evidence that could destroy him, buried in his own backyard like a time bomb waiting to explode. Cullman County, September 23, 2015. Jake Morrison never expected to inherit his grandfather's maintenance business, much less the contract to renovate the old Whitfield barn. At 28, he'd planned to stay in Birmingham after college, but Dale Morrison's sudden heart attack had brought him back to the county where 3 generations of his family had lived and worked. The irony of working on the Whitfield property wasn't lost on Jake. His grandfather had often mentioned the elderly woman who'd lived there, how she'd called the courthouse whenever her water pump acted up or her electrical system flickered. Dale had always responded personally, treating Mrs. Whitfield with the kind of respect he'd shown few others in his later years. The Whitfield property had been sold twice since Eleanor's death in 1997. The current owners, a young couple from Atlanta looking for a weekend retreat, wanted to convert the century-old barn into a rustic event venue. Jake's crew had been working on the foundation for 3 days when they hit the concrete slab that shouldn't have been there. "This don't make sense," said Tommy Fletcher, Jake's lead carpenter and a Cullman County native. "Why would somebody pour concrete way back here behind the hay storage?" The slab was roughly 6 feet by 4 feet, located in the darkest corner of the barn where farm equipment had once been stored. Jake studied the building's original blueprints, yellow documents his grandfather had kept in meticulous files. The concrete wasn't part of the original construction. According to the plans, that corner should have been dirt floor like the rest of the barn. "We need to break it up to run the new electrical, see," Jake decided. "Get the jackhammer." The concrete was surprisingly thick, nearly 8 inches, and had been reinforced with heavy wire mesh. As Tommy worked the jackhammer, the slab broke apart in jagged chunks, revealing dark soil underneath. The smell that rose from the exposed earth was musty and strange, like old newspapers left in a damp basement. Jake was shoveling the broken concrete into a wheelbarrow when the blade of his spade struck something metallic. He knelt and carefully brushed away the dark soil, revealing the tarnished corner of what looked like a briefcase or toolbox. "Tommy, come look at this." They worked together to uncover the object completely. It was a metal toolbox, red paint faded to rust brown, with Holloway painted in white letters across the top. The latches were corroded, but still functional. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he opened the box. Inside, wrapped in deteriorated plastic, were Bobby Holloway's courthouse identification badge, his wallet containing $47, and a faded photo of Margaret, and a manila folder filled with what appeared to be official documents. "Jesus Christ," Tommy whispered. "Ain't this the guy that disappeared back in the 80s? My daddy used to talk about it." Jake carefully lifted out the manila folder. The documents inside were water-stained but readable, photocopies of county purchasing records, construction contracts, and correspondence between courthouse officials. One letter, dated March 10, 1980, just 5 days before Bobby's disappearance, was addressed to the State Attorney General's office in Montgomery. The letter was in Bobby's careful handwriting. "I'm writing to report irregularities in Cullman County construction contracts that I believe constitute fraud and embezzlement. As maintenance supervisor, I have discovered that certain officials have been..." The rest of the letter was too water-damaged to read clearly, but the phrase "overbilling schemes" was visible, along with what appeared to be dollar amounts in the thousands. At the bottom of the toolbox, wrapped in oilcloth that had better protected it from moisture, was a small notebook filled with Bobby's observations, dates, times, overheard conversations, and detailed notes about construction projects that had cost the county far more than they should have. One entry made Jake's blood run cold. D. Morrison approved another inflated invoice today. When I questioned the pricing, he got defensive and told me to mind my own business. Something's not right here. Jake sat back on his heels, staring at the contents of the toolbox. His grandfather had worked at the courthouse during that period. Had he known what Bobby was investigating? Had he been involved in whatever happened to him? The late afternoon sun slanted through the barn's open doors, casting long shadows across the disturbed concrete and exposed earth. The young couple from Atlanta who owned the property were expecting a status update on the renovation, but Jake knew this discovery would change everything. He pulled out his cell phone and dialed the Cullman County Sheriff's Department. After 35 years, Bobby Holloway's case was about to be reopened, and Jake wasn't sure he was ready for what they might find. Cullman County Sheriff's Department, October 15, 2015. Detective Sarah Chen had transferred to Cullman County from Birmingham, specifically because she wanted to work cold cases in a smaller department. Bobby Holloway's file was 3 inches thick, filled with witness statements, search reports, and dead-end leads that had frustrated investigators for decades. The discovery of Bobby's toolbox had energized the entire department, but it also presented challenges. Most of the original investigators had retired or died. Sheriff Patterson had passed away in 2003, and Dale Morrison's sudden death earlier that year meant losing one of the few people who might have provided crucial insights. Chen spent 2 weeks cataloging and analyzing the documents from Bobby's toolbox. The pattern that emerged was clear. Bobby had uncovered a systematic scheme involving inflated construction contracts, phantom vendors, and kickbacks to county officials. The amounts weren't huge by modern standards, but in 1980 the missing funds totaled nearly $200,000, enough to buy several houses in Cullman County. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Margaret Holloway, now 73, and living in a nursing home in Huntsville, had maintained all of Bobby's personal papers. When Chen visited her with Bobby's recovered belongings, Margaret's eyes lit up with a clarity that surprised the nursing staff. "He was scared those last few days," Margaret told Chen, holding Bobby's faded courthouse ID badge. "Didn't want to tell me why, but I could see it. He kept checking the locks on the doors, making sure the curtains were closed when he worked on his papers at the kitchen table." Margaret led Chen to a storage unit she'd maintained for 35 years, filled with Bobby's belongings and memories she couldn't bear to discard. In a box marked Bobby's work stuff, Chen found additional notes in Bobby's handwriting, observations he'd apparently kept separate from the ones buried with his toolbox. These notes contained names: County Commissioner Herbert Burt Lawson, construction contractor Marcus Webb, and most surprisingly Dale Morrison, Bobby's own supervisor and friend. Jake Morrison struggled with the implications as Chen shared her findings with him. His grandfather, the man who'd raised him after his parents had divorced, had been involved in Bobby's disappearance. The weight of that knowledge sat heavy on Jake's shoulders as he accompanied Chen to search Dale Morrison's old house, now part of Jake's inheritance. In the backyard garden, partially overgrown with weeds and neglect, they found disturbed soil near an old oak tree. Buried 3 feet down was another metal container, this one holding additional documents in Dale Morrison's handwriting, including what appeared to be a confession he'd never sent. The letter, dated December 15, 1995, was addressed to Sheriff Patterson, but had never been mailed. "Tom, I can't carry this anymore. Bobby Holloway didn't just disappear. I was involved in his death, and I've been living with the guilt for 15 years. He discovered that I was taking money from contractors in exchange for approving inflated invoices. When he threatened to report it, I panicked. I asked him to meet me at the old logging road to talk, hoping I could convince him to stay quiet. But Bobby was too honest for his own good. He said stealing from the county was stealing from every taxpayer, from every family trying to make an honest living. When I tried to grab his briefcase, he pulled away and fell, hitting his head on a rock. He was unconscious, bleeding, and I panicked. I thought he was dying, and I knew if he lived, he'd expose everything. I made a terrible decision that I've regretted every day since. I moved his body to a remote location and buried him, then disposed of his evidence in the Whitfield barn. Margaret deserves to know the truth. The county deserves to know the truth. But I'm a coward who spent 15 years being eaten alive by guilt instead of doing what's right." Chen cross-referenced the letter with county records and medical files. Dale Morrison had indeed sought treatment for anxiety and depression starting in 1980, and his gambling problems were well documented in court records from his divorce proceedings. The final piece of the puzzle came from Marcus Webb, the contractor, who was still alive and living in a nursing home in Decatur. When Chen visited him with copies of the documents, his fragmented memories confirmed Morrison's account. Dale was in deep with his gambling debts. Webb told Chen, "Desperate men do desperate things. I should have never got him involved in the kickbacks, but he needed the money and I needed someone on the inside. When that maintenance fellow started poking around, Dale got spooked." According to Webb, Morrison had called him on March 15, 1980, in a state of panic. Bobby was dead, and Morrison needed help covering it up. Webb had advised him to bury the evidence separately from the body, hoping to eliminate any connection if one was discovered without the other. "We thought we were being smart," Webb said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But there ain't no smart way to cover up something like that. It just eats at you until there's nothing left." The case officially closed on November 3, 2015. Bobby's remains were never found. The remote location Morrison had mentioned was too vague, and decades of erosion and development had changed the landscape. But Margaret finally had answers, and the county had confronted a truth it had unknowingly buried for 35 years. Jake Morrison completed the barn renovation as a memorial to Bobby Holloway, despite the personal cost of learning about his grandfather's involvement. A small plaque near the entrance reads, "In memory of Robert Bobby Holloway, who believed that truth matters more than comfort." Margaret lived just long enough to see Bobby's name cleared and his integrity restored. She passed away peacefully 6 months later, finally able to let go of the questions that had haunted her for more than 3 decades. The Cullman County Commission issued a formal apology and established the Robert Holloway Ethics Fund, supporting transparency initiatives in local government. The money recovered from the construction scheme had been small, but the cost to the community, measured in lost trust and a good man's life, had been immeasurable. Jake kept his grandfather's confession letter, not as a memento, but as a reminder. In the margins, Dale Morrison had written notes to himself over the years. "Tell Margaret the truth. Go to the police. Stop being a coward." The tragedy wasn't just that Bobby had died for doing the right thing, but that Dale Morrison had lived for 35 years, knowing he could have prevented it all by simply being honest from the beginning. The story became a reminder that in small communities, secrets have a way of surviving long after the people who created them are gone. But sometimes, if you're willing to dig deep enough, through concrete slabs and buried guilt, through decades of silence and misdirection, the truth finds a way to surface. And when it does, it brings with it both justice for the innocent and a reckoning for those who chose silence over courage.